Okay, all right, terrific. Well, I'm not going to talk about anything thematic at all. I'm just going to show a few pictures. But I wanted to sort of say a couple of things just before I show you the pictures. One is that as I try and understand, me personally, as I try and understand the problems that we're facing and, you know, think about the future, I get dragged back further into the past. So I kind of started off in the 70s, really. And then looking at Australian theatre in the 70s. Then I drifted back to the 60s, then the 50s, and now I'm in the interwar period and before that. So, you know, God knows where I'll go next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that work. And there's a little bit of a story here with some people in it. And then there's a little bit of an idea. And that's all. It's really minimal stuff. It's not big. So I'm just going to share this screen. Here we go. Can you see that? Keith, will you give me a thumbs up if the yeah, great.
Can you make it full screen, Julian, by clicking the bottom on the bottom right hand side of your screen?
Yeah.
So one button along. Not that one.
Not that one.
Left. Go left.
Go left.
Go left again.
Go left again. Oh, I see this one.
Click that one. Wonderful.
Is that good?
Very
okay. Good. So here's one of my favourite places to visit, which is Melbourne General Cemetery. I often go there because for me, the dead aren't really gone. They're still a presence in my life, which is a very historian thing to say. And here are two graves side by side. They come from the Jewish sector of the cemetery. Interestingly, I thought all the Jewish people would be together, but they're not. The Orthodox Jews are in a separate part, and these are the kind of the Reformed Jews. So the one on the left is Dolia Rebush, and the one on the right is Rosa Rebush. And they are both Russian-speaking Latvians who came to Melbourne in 1928. And Dolia had studied at the Russian Riga Theatre, and I think maybe also the Moscow Arts Theatre, I'm not quite sure. But he was certainly the first Stanislavskian-trained actor to come to Australia. He set up this company called the Rebush Players with Rosa's help. She did the translations of the plays they did, and he did the directing. And his business manager was A.A. Phillips. And A.A. Phillips, as you probably know, is the man who wrote the Cultural Cringe essay in 1950, and more or less single-handedly, I think, sometimes, brought the concept of Australian culture into full visibility. And so at no point in my 20 years of research had anybody ever mentioned that his best friend was a Russian-speaking Latvian Jew and that he had spent the first 14 years of his career in theatre. That just need not occur in any of the, you know, the secondary literature. So I was kind of a bit taken aback by that. So this is what Dolia looked like in 1928. And I won't, you know, kind of bore you with this story, except it's a complicated one and it involves White Russians and Russian revolutions and so forth, and nearly getting shot and so forth. You know, I often think, well, what distinguishes Australians full stop, and Australian artists in particular? And the answer is they've all got interesting stories or interesting family stories because so many people come from somewhere else. Okay. This is Rosa. Dolia died unexpectedly in 1947. And I want to say that if he hadn't died, the whole history of Australian theatre would be different. But he did die. But Rosa carried on sort of his legacy. She was a great supporter of Meanjin as A.A. Phillips got more involved with Meanjin. And towards the end of their lives, they lived together. And they died sort of relatively shortly after each other. So A.A. Phillips, Rosa and Dolia were part of a very close network of artists that crossed all the art forms. So they were close to Vance and Nettie Palmer and the kind of literary Australians, but they were also close to William Dargie and the visual kind of painting Australians. And when I'm in this space, when I'm doing my archive work, I'm amazed by the degree of social conviviality. And I'm reminded, I have to say, of the kind of conviviality that Currency and Currency House also encourage. Because it's much more than about just the art, it's about how you live the life. Julian was an entrepreneur, and quite a successful one. He was a chocolatier. He made chocolates. And Alison was accusing me earlier of being too nice to people by flattering them, which I think is quite true, although I like to flatter people because they deserve it. And Doyle had a sort of
a definition of flattery.
No, I don't. Doyle had the equivalent of that, which was he would send people chocolates. So he had a small chocolate factory, and he would send the chocolates, and it was amazing how people were like, "Oh, this chocolate's wonderful. Let me support your theatre company." So there you go. And that's him in his factory with Bush's confectionery, which I think lasted until after the war. And then Australia had a sugar shortage and they closed the factory down. So these are the bits that I want to really show you. So this is The Lower Depths. He did a production of Maxim Gorky's play in 1936. So you may know a little bit about The Lower Depths. It's about the underclass of the Russians, I think set in St. Petersburg. It's a very grim play. Harriet Taylor did a wonderful production of it in Melbourne about 10 or 12 years ago that I've never forgotten. It's so grim. And I think it's worth remembering or thinking about what effect this play would have had in Australia at the height of the Depression. So the height of the Depression was actually 1932, when nearly a third of the workforce in Australia were out of work. Australia was the second worst affected country in the Depression in the world because of its susceptibility to basically the price of primary products. And it is still susceptible to that, or I should say, putting it more accurately, it is susceptible to that again because of the choices that government made in the 1970s and the 1980s to deindustrialize. This production was a sensation. Nobody had ever seen, because it was basically a Stanislavskian style production. And up until that time, J.C. Williamson, who were the main sort of theatre people really, had maintained a monopoly not only on the production of professional theatre, but on the idea of what professionalism was. So we were talking, I think, earlier today about, these categories, amateur, professional, and so forth. Max, you mentioned them right at the beginning. These do not have an innocent history. These have a long and complicated history. And what you got, I think, with the Lower Depths was you got a challenge to what the idea of professionalism was. And so, and believe me, the Tate brothers who were running J.C. Williamson at that time were very aware of what that challenge was. Doyle Rebush, who's obviously a darling, did, I think, an extraordinary thing. He was a very slow director. Like, some of his productions took up to 18 months to prepare, so they went forever. And he threw open his rehearsal room to people. People would come and they would look at the rehearsals. So that's an interesting thing, because you kind of think, oh, well, how can we reach out to people who aren't us? And Doyle kind of did it. And I think he did it just naturally. He was just like, no, come along, have a look, see the way in which we work. And they did. And actually, Nettie Palmer writes about it in her diary. She writes about what she saw. And of course, what you see, as David Pledger was talking earlier, David so beautifully saying, it's practice. We just do it over and over again. And people are like, this is kind of boring, but it's also kind of fascinating. And we're kind of learning a bit, about what theatre really is, as opposed to the J.C. Williamson bling. Their sort of second major production, it was done at the Comedy Theatre, which is 900 seats, which at that time was considered to be a small theatre, was The Cherry Orchard it wasn't quite the first production of a Chekhov in Australia. There's a 3-day kind of run of a semi-amateur production in Perth that Paul Hasluck reviewed and said, nobody should ever see this, it's just awful. But the first kind of proper Chekhov, a la Chekhov, in the spirit of Chekhovs that we all know, was done by Dolia in 1938. There it is, very bad photograph of what it looks like. This is kind of on Broadway, Australian style, 1938, which means it was done on Exhibition Street. So something was happening there about, we often talk in terms of small to medium versus the major organizations. But when you go back in time to, the 1930s and the 1940s, the relationship between these things is much, much more fluid. And I could give many, many examples of that. Frank Tate ran J.C. Williamson, and I came across a photograph of him playing Oswald in Ghosts in 1922. And what that means is that he was up to his neck in modern experimental theatre, because nobody plays that part unless in some way they are already beholden to the idea of, kind of cutting edge art. So perhaps we've accepted those divisions like we've accepted the professional amateur division. We accept them too easily without really kind of thinking about, well, what do they involve? And how can they be, kind of more active? Now, this is what I really wanted to show you. Oh, yeah, well, this too. In 1944, in the height of the war, Dolia Rebush staged Douglas Stewart's Ned Kelly. And this is an amazing story. You couldn't make this stuff up. It's so incredible. I staged Ned Kelly in 1997, and I produced a complete lemon. So when I was saying to Larry and Astrid and Alison and Harriet earlier, it was only when I failed that I really felt that I was an artist. I was thinking about Ned Kelly and the fact that I fucked that play up so badly. So it was kind of interesting for me to read about the first production of it, having done a production of it. And again, nobody had ever mentioned to me in the entire time that I had been working Ned Kelly, working on the play or reading around it, that the first production was done by a Latvian-speaking Russian. No, nobody had ever mentioned that. But it was, and in the height of the war. Norman Lindsay did the design for it. And these are the set models that I pulled out of the archive in order to reconstruct his set design for Ned Kelly. And what's so interesting about this is that the play was seen by a 16-year-old schoolboy called Manning Clark. And he saw this play and he went, I'm going to be an Australian historian. So interesting. You talk about the influence of the arts and this wider influence. If this production had not taken place, Manning Clark wouldn't be an Australian historian. And I don't know where that would leave Australian history more broadly, but the answer is somewhere different. Here are the costume designs. There's some beautiful costume designs. These are, I think, from the drinkers in the first pub scene. These sketches, which are occasionally kind of dragged out and shown as part of kind of, kind of Norman Lindsay exhibitions, are, again, Larry, exactly what you were saying, this bit of the story is separated from that bit of the story. You don't get the whole story, you get just a little tiny bit of it, but the whole story of it is fucking amazing. Yeah. Okay, and this is the real bit that I need to talk to you about. So in 1946, all the theatre companies got together with the leadership of the new theatre and approached the government to change its policy framework around arts and culture. So the name of the organisation was SEMA. And Larry, you were mentioning this division between entertainment on the one hand and kind of art on the other, I suppose. And I don't necessarily, I suspect that goes way back to ancient Greek and people kind of going, oh, Euripides is up himself. But for our purposes, it goes back to the war. And this division between ENSA, which was the acronym for the body that provided entertainment to the troops, and SEMA, which was the body that provided art for the home audience. And that division, we've lived with that division for the best part of 80 years. So we didn't invent it, but nor is it eternal. It's something that existed within the policy space back then, and we have inherited it. And I want to say, like we have inherited a lot of other things. And that's what I mean by sometimes, and I'm only saying sometimes, not all the time. If you want to go forward, you have to go back. I just want to, I know you can't read what's said on this because it's too small, but I have it on my other computer, and I just want to read a little bit of it out for you, because I think it's a conversation in many ways, which is not unlike the conversation we're having now. And I have often tried to imagine this conversation and what it was involved, and regretted that we could not meet these people on some ground where we could say, these are our problems, and they could say, well, these are our problems. And we could kind of talk to the past in the same way that we talk to each other, because I think that there would be a lot to say and also a lot to hear. So when David is talking, or David Pledger was talking this wonderful question, how can we listen better? I would say, how can we listen better to the past? Because it is always in our ear. Okay, so this document starts by just saying, look, we're meeting together, and it's kind of everybody. You have to sort of accept a couple of things. One is that it talks about theatre, but it wants to talk more broadly. So even though it's called the National Theatre Movement, it's not really about just theatre. And the second thing is, it doesn't have a very high regard for commercial values. So it's always slagging off commercial theatre, but that comes from just feeling like it's been stuffed over by J.C. Williamson for so long. I don't necessarily think that it really hates commercial theatre, but it distrusts it. So it goes on, it wants to elect a committee, you know, a peak body, just like you've been talking about, in order to talk to government. And then it talks about the definition of the movement. I'm just going to read a little bit of this out, just a little taste for you. The movement which we recommend should be called the Commonwealth Theatre Movement, is one to bring the arts of the theatre to the people of Australia as a whole. The committee is therefore of the opinion that it should be developed on a Commonwealth-wide basis, all states acting in concert and with the minimum of delay. So you have that holistic view right there and then, that everybody is included, and that's why it should come from the federal government. Yeah, and then they slag off commercial theatre a bit. Then they also say, oh, this is kind of interesting as well. Since it seems advisable to develop a program gradually, we recommend that first consideration be given to the establishment of 2 professional touring dramatic companies, the headquarters of the one to be situated in Melbourne and the other in Sydney. So that straight away it went to the idea of touring. So it had an idea of the geography of Australia. And I know that that was the original vision that kind of inspired John Bell and the Bell Shakespeare Company. But these people would have looked at the idea that state theatre companies kind of basically stay in capital cities and people come to them. They would have looked at that with, they wouldn't have liked that, basically. And here's just a couple of things from the second page. Just read a couple of them out to you. Great. Okay, I'll just go down to purposes served by the movement. So it's from the third passage. I think this is a useful list, not perfect list. I'm not making any claims here about, oh, let's go back to this. I'm just saying it's noteworthy that these people had these ideas at this time. It will give artists and playwrights a means of communicating with their fellows, and as such, it will be of great benefit to the community, since artistic expression and appreciation are important parts of our democratic way of living. And that goes to both what Astrid said, but also to what Justin was talking about this morning. It will supply drama, at least, and ultimately ballet and opera, two outlying centres, many of the inhabitants of which have never had the opportunity of seeing a flesh and blood presentation of a high standard. So straight away it's reaching out. But don't think of opera and sort of theatre as kind of like, oh, what are we going to do? It's elite. Just think of it as where people were at then. And then you'll kind of get the spirit of it. Thirdly, it will bridge the gap which has developed between the Australian dramatist and the theatre, and thus help to foster the growth of Australian literature. So that was a very particular thing at that time, was the link between the literary world and the theatre world. And, you know, in terms of Currency House, I would say that that is a permanent bridge that was established between those two worlds. And when I go back to the 30s, that bridge isn't there. And lovely, lovely section here. It will be of great importance to young people, first because it is theatrical and will therefore provoke a response from its audience. And secondly, because it is dramatic, thus giving drive and vitality to what it will have to say. So that's Mark's point, fun. It's fun. The arts are fun. You don't have to apologize for that. You don't have to turn it into a dollar figure. They're just jolly good things to do. And I'll just finish this now. Not only will it produce good drama, ballet and opera as well, it will also produce it cheaply enough to be accessible to all. So, and there's more of it. Curtin and Menzies, who could not agree on anything, agreed on one thing, which was they wouldn't fund the arts. So I think that was a disastrous decision. I think John Curtin made a very serious mistake. And I think that if the National Theatre Movement's principles had been adopted, we would be looking at a very different ecology today, because the basic infrastructure would have come out of the rebuilding process at the end of the Second World War, instead of being delayed until the 1950s. One more thing, or a couple more things. How are we to understand this history? So that's the problem that I'm currently thinking about, which I think also, for me, becomes a problem of part and wholes. So I hear many, many arguments about, you know, kind of like democratic culture, who's up, who's down, elite art versus kind of popular art. And I'm always persuaded by the last person I've listened to, you know, like, whoa, yeah, you're right. No, you're right too. So I've been thinking about, how does this all come together? How do we, if you like, preserve our diversity and yet talk a unified story? I think it can be done. And I wanted to show you this picture. So this is an artist's representation of a holon, a holonic relationship, if you like. And you're like, oh yeah, what's that at home? So I wanted to show you what the definition was. So it's a Greek word, and it's something that is simultaneously a whole in and of itself, as well as part of a larger whole. And so it's to do with part-whole relationships. And when I was going through my Arthur Koestler period, when I was in my early 20s, it actually comes out of his book, Ghost in the Machine. I couldn't bear rereading that book now, because I remember it as quite turgid. But I did go back and, you know, think about holonic relationships, which means that we can actually express the relationship between things in a way that is both connected but non-hierarchical. So there's a little bit here in Kirsten's formulation. A holon is something that has integrity and identity while simultaneously being part of a larger system. It is a subsystem of a greater system. So it is a way of kind of, it's a policy approach basically, or the principles of a policy approach, going, you don't always have to choose. You don't always have to choose between community arts and opera houses. Sometimes you can understand the relationship as, you know, holonic. Which does not mean that, you know, you collapse the differences into something that looks like, you know, kind of pasteurized milk. But it means that you are aware of kind of, as it were, what they have in common, as well as what is different from them. And, you know, the story of my story, in terms of going back into the 30s, is that the further back you go, the less resources people have, but the more in common they have as artists. So, you know, there's a whole issue there about whether as we have been more successful in terms of getting subsidy from the government, whether it's accentuated our differences, and whether now, once again, we are unsuccessful, whether the kind of cloud in the silver lining in the cloud is that we can once again discover what we have in common. That's it from me.
So, were you going to throw to someone else?
I am. Alison and then John, I think, if that's okay.
Sorry, do you mind if I just say a couple of things?
Yeah.
To you? I mean, that's fascinating history, and the language of it is great. But a couple of things I wanted to see. That one in the committee there was Hugh Essen, and of course he was Louis Essen's son.
Yeah.
He was dead by this stage, but his wife Hilda was very big in amateur circles in Melbourne.
Yeah.
But Louis's great friend and the great unsung hero of Australian theatre is Leon Brodsky, or Spencer Brodney.
Yeah.
And he was advocating a national theatre from 1903.
Yes,
Table talk.
right.
You know, he was 19.
Yeah.
And he carried that through even when he went away.
Yeah. Sorry, John.
No. I mean, it's just that I think that that notion of a national theatre has gone through many manifestations.
Yeah.
He was advocating a national theatre that was basically about a national drama.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Louis was basing his national theatre on the Irish, which was basically about separating the Irish theatre from the English.
Totally.
But the other slight observation was that there was a lobbyist for Curtin and for Menzies, and that was Nugget.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was appointed as the post-war Reconstruction Commissioner.
Yeah.
But the other fantastic relationship there is Leslie Reeves.
Yeah.
They were great mates, and it was Leslie who, with Doris Fitton and a group of others in the mid-30s, actually did establish a sort of another national theatre to do with what you were just suggesting in this manifestation, which was to actually bring the theatre and Australian drama together.
Yeah.
So it has been fantastic how it has sort of like moved its way across the centuries.
Yeah.
I think it's time again to consider the national theatre movement, but in a different way.
Well, I think you're right. Let me just adjust slightly, because I've just been writing about this particular issue. Leon Brodsky's idea for a national theatre was actually the answer to a question. Mm. And the question that he asked is, why in Australia is there a gap between our national life and our national culture? And when I read that question, I was electrified by it, because I thought it's the same question that I've got now. And so, he reached for a national theatre, which I have to say was a little bit of a kind of like where people were at at the turn of the Federation, and where they were at later after the war and so forth. But the question is I think still the question that we have now generally is the one that we've been asking for the last 2 days. But Alison, I'm so sorry.
Well, no, I'm just thinking what I'm going to talk about is extremely prosaic after this. But I was thinking one of the things as you were talking, to go even further back, it was about the idea of peak body and about touring. As far as I know, that all came out of the Soviets again, but someone mentioned that we're all Marxist in this group, and that's sort of coming through all the time. And it was a guy called Lunacharsky, who was Lenin's cultural czar, who promulgated all of this. The groups, the peer groups, the peak bodies, the touring, the artists all getting together. And if you go back, and there's a lot of connections between Melbourne particularly and the Russians in that period. I mean, they were in touch with each other.
Yeah, the National Playwrights Conference is another version of the National Theatre as well.
Yeah, totally.
Anyway, I'm digressing. I'm going to be, as I say, very prosaic. What I wanted to talk about with you as a group was the thing that came out of the Currency House paper that I wrote with Julian Meyrick quite a few years ago, and it's something that has stayed in my mind because it hasn't ever gone away as a problem, which is the fact that we have no international cultural agency that makes sense. We have the Australia Council and we have bits and bobs of DFAT, And I think I'm just going to talk more to this in a minute. If we look at what the Australia Council's been doing over the last, I don't know, probably 20 years, you can say that it's very problematic. It's messy, it's reactive rather than proactive. It doesn't have much policy going for it. And to me, one of the really difficult things, and I'm sorry if this offends somebody, is that the people that are running it often are not as experienced as they should be. The people, or as knowledgeable about what we can do as a nation internationally. They're knowledgeable in their own ways, of course. And that DFAT, in my experience of working with them for decades, I'm more sympathetic to, because I think that they're staffed by people who understand our relationship to the world, and they're staffed by people who are very often extremely culturally tuned to how we as Australia might be seeing ourselves in relation to the rest of the world. They're not arts people, but they're sympathetic to it. So if there was going to be a, you know, sort of relationship for my proposed international cultural agency, which is what Carrillo and my proposal was all those years ago, and I still think has need, that's the way that I would be moving. But it would be not part of DFAT, but a agency that is related to DFAT. And I'll talk about in a minute about the Gertrum Institute, which to me is the body that I've worked with overseas that seems to work the best that I have ever seen in terms of an agency. And they have an agreement with the federal government of Germany through the German Foreign Office to do X, Y, Z, and they get funding through the Foreign Office, but they are separate from it. Now, I've sort of jumped in a bit. I was going to start off with talking about why we need such a thing, and I was going to take as read the sort of point that we need to engage. I mean, Australians, we've sort of implied it through this. Justin was, I think, saying that we're a nation of, you know, it's some relationship. Most of us have got immigrants in our past. We've got relationships to elsewhere. We understand the advantage of talking to other people and about ourselves. So I'm not going to go into that. I hope that's a sort of automatic sort of thing. I would want to say that Australia needs it more, this sort of engagement in a sensible way with others more than maybe other cultures do. And there are a number of reasons for this. And we all know that geographically, we are still a long way away in terms of people moving around, in terms of objects moving around. And that people other from elsewhere don't want to come here because they say, oh, it's all too far. They still will say that to you all the time. I think that for many people outside Australia, they don't understand our culture at all, and it gets sort of derided or confused or conflated or parodied or seen as much more superficial and less interesting than it is, and much more simplistic than it is. And so therefore we have an added impetus to be saying what we are doing, what we are thinking, how we are, you know, sort of reinterpreting the world. I think we've got a tricky history internationally because of our White Australia policy, which is still reverberates in many parts of the world, and the implication that we're all racist, which comes up still, maybe rightly, probably rightly in many ways, but maybe not as blanketedly as some people around the world might say. So we have to, in a way, I'm not trying to this is language, I was going to say whitewash. I'm not trying to discount that, but to say that, you know, we have added reasons to be saying who we are. And again, the instance that interests me all the time, and I'm going to talk about the Gertrum Institute and the Japan Foundation as two agencies that I've worked with fairly closely. They are both funded and run by countries that have similar problematic sort of national stereotypes to us, and yet particularly the Germans have done, you know, incredibly well in all sorts of ways to sort of counter that. Japanese maybe less so, but still they're, you know, people aren't sort of confused in a way about who they are. This forum is about coming out of COVID, and COVID has emphasised that thing that is in Australia of xenophobia and Fortress Australia. There are 1,000 examples of this in the press all the time coming up about keep the borders up, we don't want anyone in, blah, blah, blah. So we need, I think, to be sort of managing that and sort of pushing back against it. The last sort of reason about why is that all, I think pretty well all equivalent countries to us have an international cultural agency. You go through them all, they are pretty well all doing it, and they all seem to have to not be wanting to shut them down or to change it. We are the one out. I argued a few years ago for a Australian cultural centre in Indonesia, and I know excuse me, I got traction because I said, of all the countries in the world that don't have a cultural centre in Indonesia, do you know who the two are? One is Australia, next door, and one is America. Problematic in terms of the relationship between America and Indonesia. Everybody else did. China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, India, Poland, France, Germany, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was an amazing contrast of who wasn't sort of saying, being proactive in what we are doing and what we are saying as a cultural nation. As I said, what there is now is the Australia Council, which has this dual role of internal and international activity. And in my experience, this is an opinion, doing it very poorly, very reactively, and doing things now that really are symptomatic of a rudderless sort of institution. Like they are trying to do the programs themselves instead of creating policy and handling funding. They are so distant from their constituency that they are not able to say, there are experts out there in our country who can do this for us better than we can do it, and probably always cheaper. So problematic with the Australia Council. DFAT's lost a lot of funding, but as I say, I personally have always, not always, but pretty well always found them to be pretty on the ball. So a preference from me. My proposal is for one international agency, whatever, that it stands alone, but if it has a minister, that's the DFAT minister. That it's staffed by arts international experts, people who actually know and care what they do and are in it for the long term. That the focus is on the world, but with Asia at its centre. As I've said, I was the person that ran Asia Link Arts for a long time, so I think the relationship to Asia in the arts community has changed enormously, and people are, by and large, very enthusiastic, comfortable, whatever, working with Asia. Maybe not so much for the bureaucrats, but for the arts organisation, that is so. That the role is to be both policy and providing funds to arts organisations and individuals, not to do it. And not to do things like country programs. When I see these country programs, I want to reach for my revolver. And some principles behind this, which I've sort of filched from some old AsiaLink material, but to be based on quality programs, being open to ideas and new ventures, working in partnerships, having excellent personal networks, and always adding value. That's the main part of what I wanted to say, because I've sort of got 5 minutes and I've probably taken more than that. But I did want to go over what is two of these agencies that I admire. One is the Gertrum Institute, and this is from its annual report of 2019-20, where they use words like a culture of innovation in their annual report. They talk about encouraging dialogue. An interesting phrase they use is to convey a comprehensive picture of Germany, note that it's not a positive picture of Germany. They are sophisticated enough to not insist, as we've been talking about saying everything is fantastic in that place, and that, you know, artists have the right and the expectation to be challenging what they do. The Institute is 70 years old, it works in 90 countries. It's based in Munich, which is interesting, not in the federal government, in the, you know, capital of Berlin, which is interesting. It always works with partners, both institutional and individual. As I said, there's an agreement between them and the government to do what they do, and the budget comes through the Foreign Office. They have 1,000 employees, an overall budget of 370 million euros for both, but they teach language, that's part of their role, and cultural programs. For the cultural program, they have a budget in the last financial year of 208 million euros, which is $300 million Australian dollars. On a population equivalence, which I know doesn't quite work, but for what it's worth, Germany has 3 times as much as us. So in our terms, that would be $100 million, which would be just fine for my agency. Happy to have that. The Japan Foundation is a lot straighter. For those of you who worked with it, they will know this. But behind the straightness, there's a lot of really innovative and knowledgeable and experienced people who work with pretty well everywhere, to my knowledge, around Asia really, really well. The focus is on cultural exchange and deepening understanding, providing opportunities for interaction. It was founded in 1972, again with language, Japanese studies, and there's a focus as well as arts programs. It's under their Foreign Office, and it's in Tokyo in its own building. In 2019, it had an arts budget. This is a bit hard to unpick because they include things like the Asia Centre, which does a number of things, between 100 and 150 million Australian dollars. Again, a rough thing to say, they've got 4 times our population, so their funding is less, I think, according to this, than what the Germans say, although it always seems to me they have oodles of money. The Australia Council has, as a comparison, has a total income, I think, of around 200 million a year, something like that. But it's really hard to find out how much they spend on international. I had a really good look at their material, and there was a heap of graphs, there was a heap of percentages, there was a heap of, you know, how much an artist paid, blah, blah, blah. Not in figures, but no figures that I could see. So it was hard to sort of make an equivalence, but I'm sure it's a whole lot less than $100 million on international. Well, I know it's a whole lot less. For my agency or the idea to work, the money would have to come from the Australia Council, be taken away, and they would fight that. When this program came up before, Carrillo and I went to see the then Arts Minister, Simon Crean, and he sort of was interested in what we were saying, but then things all went a bit wobbly in that area and it sort of fell off the agenda. But obviously the implication was that the OSCO would fight this, which is understood. But my counter argument to that is that that's not a reason not to have this, and that it just needs political will. And we know we have an enormous amount of political will in this country for such things. The end. Back to you, Justin. I think John's going to speak, isn't he?
Yeah, John is.
This was because I was saying this because it was in the program under infrastructure.
Yeah,
I wanted to get my little beef in.
Yeah, no, it's my fault for leading us off track. John, do you want to talk now?
Oh, look, yes, I'll say a couple of quick things. My platform paper was on the state of the music theatre sector in 2015. And in a way, I'm singing Mark's song, Who's Having Fun and at Whose Expense? Because that's the nature of where the music theatre sector still is, and probably worse off. But one of the things that I talked about in the problems associated with the sector at that time came from the recognition of Live Performance Australia's figures about ticket revenue for various aspects of the theatre. $348 million was the 2016 figure for ticket sales for musicals in Australia. And the shocking recognition there, of course, is that given our propensity to bring foreign product into our musical theatre sector, it basically meant that roughly $34 million we were sending checks to New York or London. Now, that's a huge amount of money to actually remove from our artistic cultural ecology when it could be put to much better use here. By comparison, of course, the theatre, the attendance figures were roughly about $80 million as far as the ticket revenue was concerned. So we're talking about an industry that is roughly 4 times the level of what we regard as the straight theatre. So I think that there were some issues to actually face. Not only the importation of the foreign product, but the fact that we weren't encouraging the creation of local work. And what that meant was that we weren't giving opportunities to our composers, to our arrangers, to our directors and designers and so on, the craft people. Yes, the argument always is that these big projects that come in provide great numbers of opportunities for Australian performers, but at what cost? That was the basic argument for my paper. And looking at how we actually dealt with this, and I proposed that in fact we've got to start to see that the development of Australian musicals is we're not just after the big commercial musicals, we've got to see that there's a recognition that there is a studio sort of musical, the small scale that we see that it's somewhere like the Hayes Theatre in Sydney. There's what I call the Bijou musical that would fit into the 300-seat theatre spaces. Then we'd actually look at something like a Boulevard Street musical, which was like Sydney Theatre Company or Queensland Theatre Company or Melbourne Theatre Company, that scale, the full commercial theatre enterprise. And then there was the big arena musicals that we see with projects like Hand Opera on the Park, those sorts of extravaganzas. Of course, people like Lyndon Terracini and John Frost at that particular time were very anti-musicals, anti-Australian product, anti-Australian operas. In fact, Lyndon was on record at just saying that they just didn't sell. So what was the point in investing in local product? Since 2015, we have had a little success with the development of musicals. Probably the most successful has been Fangirls, which has been revived after we opened the theatres after the pandemic. But Fangirls was a neat little Australian musical that was opened at Belvoir Street and played to that Bijou sector, very manageable. The 2 problematic musicals that we actually had, not in terms of their quality, but in terms of how they were generated and the amount of work that was given over to their development, was Ladies in Black, which was a collaboration, well, basically it was a collaboration between, it was a production that came out of Queensland Theatre Company at the time. And if you talk to Richard Fotheringham about it, his head will spin on his shoulders about the problems that created for the resources of that particular company. And then when Simon collaborated on, started the collaboration on Muriel's Wedding, that was partly in association with Sydney Theatre Company and with great big commercial management. That was equally problematic for Sydney Theatre Company because the scale was just too big, and ultimately the commercial management seemed to win out in that. And of course, when it was revived in a commercial way, Sydney Theatre Company's name wasn't on it. So there was a problem of developing adequate musicals with original scores at that time, and using the sort of boulevard theatre subsidised model. Sadly, they were the 3 significant works that were established over that time. I won't go into King Kong or Moulin Rouge or the Paul Mercurio musical. But because all those things were being operated on with commercial monies generated overseas and were basically meant for Broadway. Once we actually hit the pandemic, things have got progressively worse now. Where I thought there might have been some introspection with how we actually dealt with local product or becoming insular, because out of the success of the last 10 years, we've got people like Tim Minchin and Eddie Perfect and Simon, of course. We've got the talent to create new musicals, but no one willing to actually take risks on them at this particular stage. When we opened, of course, we opened to an onslaught of foreign product again, Pippin of all things, Hamilton. And Hamilton's another story that's going to create an extraordinary problem for us in the future. You're all aware of the issue now with the cast being laid off without pay, which is a horrifying concept, but it was written into the award. So that has to be dealt with at some stage politically, but it's laid a lot of people off for an extraordinary period of time where they have no recourse. The bottom line of all this, as we inch towards the end of the day, is that I had actually suggested a proposal, which I called the Perth Solution here, which was a mechanism by which we could have a precinct that would establish a relationship between creatives, institutions, funding, and the commercial sector that would actually work with one another and support one another in the development of a range of musicals over a 12-month to 18-month period. A lot of this was based around the fact that there was a venue in Perth, His Majesty's Theatre, which was only used for 6 weeks of the year from the ballet and the opera. And it was available as a major sort of 2,000-seat venue that could be used full-time to create musicals in. The second component of it was owned by the state government, and there was a notion, having talked to the state government there, that there would be support for this project and they would financially support infrastructure. The second component of this building, this particular project, was that Perth had WAPA, a training institution that would enable and support through physical production values as well as stage management and as well as exercising skills for their students, an opportunity to enter into the market. The value for commercial producers to use this cultural precinct was that it was an out-of-town tryout for a limited 2-month theatre season. So you could actually come and live in Perth, develop your musical, whether you were international or whether you were local, be supported by a major training institution where you could use the venue that would have all the resources, rehearsal rooms, stage, and so on. You could light it, you could build it. Perth had has the best scenic construction studio in the country. So everything was shipped across the Nullarbor anyway. So all the aspects of the thing fitted together. There was a notion too that the Australia, the National Funding Agency would negotiate a cultural tourism component to this. Major state governments are now negotiating with major commercial producers internationally to bring companies into the state as far as tourist dollars are concerned. So this was another way in all that to bring the enterprise together. Look, I'm not sure how that works now, except my thinking is going, as just discussing with Julian, that there is a similar structure engaging in new media, but shifting it to Queensland and the Gold Coast now, and introducing sort of the tax benefits that one gets through the film industry into the organisation would actually assist in providing at least a platform where Australian creatives could find an opportunity to build these musicals. And with that amount of money involved, I can't see that a decent policy document couldn't be established in order to actually make this a reality. And that is a very quick précis of where I'm at, so that you've got time to actually wrap up the whole 2 days.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Julian, I'll throw back to you because it's 10 to 5.
Oh,
So if you want to just wrap up this little session, and then we can, with what we've got left of our brains,
yeah.
look to an overall wrap up.
Yeah. Well, holonic relationships. So both Alison and John have talked about specific programs. And I was just saying to Alison that at a cultural policy conference in 2014 that I think Joe Corse was at too, where we were talking about policy. Leslie Allway, who at that time was running, I think, the program into India, outreach program into India for Australia, had got up and gone, I thought cultural policy was cultural programs. And so what I think perhaps links both John and Alison is that there is a series of principles that could be better articulated by us in order to embrace things that are naturally diverse. And I just, in my heart, I want to say not everybody has to do the same thing. You know, you don't have to like everything. That's not one of the requirements of culture. If you go to a restaurant, you order a whole load of meals, a whole load of different meals, and generally speaking, you have to like them all because you've got to eat them. But that doesn't have to work with culture. So you can live in a world in which high opera and pub choir exist side by side. And I think the art of policy is learning to manage the diversity within the unity. And I think that is the challenge going forward. I actually don't think that the government that we have today, or even the one tomorrow, really matters as much as our thinking now. That's what I think. And that's what I also take from my policy, you know, from my historical work, looking back at the late 40s, going, these people were not just focused on, you know, getting the Curtin government to do something, although they were looking ahead and going, where will Australians be in a century's time? And that was Brodsky's great question, John. And I think it's a question that we should take to our hearts.
Beautifully landed. Right. So, and I've put a few notes up there as well. Look, it's 5 to 5. We've been going pretty flat chat for several hours. Feels like a lot of work. I'm not even going to try to summarise. I'm going to throw, without notice, to Harriet, not to ask you to summarise, but to ask you, you know, the extent to which the last 2 days have met your hopes and aspirations for pulling a group together. And, you know, maybe the next provocation to you is, what next?
Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's come to this event, and especially to all the speakers. It's just, it has realised everything that I was hoping it would do. I think, you know, I'm better at the big picture, thinking at the big planning, and then to hear all of your thoughts about it from the actual experience, and then that of course takes it off in completely different directions, as I knew it would. And that's incredibly valuable, because I think, as I've said during the day, that what I really want to do from this is to, and what I feel is the missing piece in what's been going on in the arts, and I've been listening to these kinds of forums and things since I was a child, is something that brings it all together. And that's actually what the pandemic has done, because I think, you know, so long as we had this belief that there was a limited pot of money and it had to be divided, so if opera got the money, then it meant that, you know, the small theatres didn't get it, or whatever. And so we had, each of us was competing against each other to say why we should be first in the queue. The pandemic has turned that around and said, oh, well, actually the economy works quite differently. And, you know, maybe there's money, there's money to invest in the infrastructure that we have allowed, the social infrastructure that we've allowed to erode over the last 40 years. So what we need now is to actually bring all those different arguments together that are all so well thought through, and show how they don't compete with each other, how they all complement each other. So this has been providing all the detail of that. And yes, the next step is to continue these conversations. And I hope that each of these talks that we've been listening to today will kind of contribute chapters to a kind of complete cultural policy that Currency House can put together that then might serve as a model for the wider industry. Yes, so yes, that's where we go next. Really, I have said that what I want to do with Currency House is to step away from the kind of retail aspect, which is the way it was kind of designed as a kind of mirror of Currency Press, and turn it more into a research centre. And I hope we'll do that with further work developing this relationship with Sydney University, with Ian's department, and also with the Create Centre, who've been so fantastic in supporting us today. And yes, also through, like, the infrastructure that I'm interested in is kind of more of a conceptual infrastructure. It's relationships and partnerships with other organisations, not just arts organisations, but other parts of our democracy, really, because I feel that all this idea of what our culture is entirely entwined with the kind of democracy we have. And what we're having at the moment is like a democratic revolution, where we're really changing our values. We're recognising problems in our culture, things like, you know, problems of corruption, problems of sexism, problems with neglecting the environment, with bushfires. It is a time of change, and I think that we can grasp that opportunity, but we really have to be prepared for it. And it's not something that just takes leadership, it actually takes deep thinking. And for that, you need to look to the history, which is what we've done with looking at the papers. And then we need to look forward to what to do next. So that's my spiel. Fantastic.
Yeah. We're about to tick to 5 o'clock, and rather than again assuming the mantle of summarising, a chance to open up the floor to everybody. If anybody just wants to throw in another tidbit or make any comment, just a chance for final drinks.
Could I ask my mother if she wants to say the final word, the patron, the one who started all of this? Mum?
Catherine?
Sorry.
What, would you like to make a pithy, insightful and possibly nuclear comment on things that are...
No, yes. All right. My brain goes a bit slowly these days, and I have to prepare it, so I'm not so good when I'm surprised into things. But I think it's been a very good conference because I've learned a lot, especially from this morning, from people's experience, and this afternoon from their thoughts, what they have been, what's been concerning them, and what they've been thinking about. I think leadership is very important. I think that we need to look around for 2 or 3 or 4 people around Australia who are prepared to stand up and just speak out. I had quite a time getting Wesley Enoch to write his paper about cultural leadership and things. And he was hiding under tables and things too, and all that. Start the thought of it and things, but he finally screwed his courage up and wrote a rather violent first page to the paper, but then settled into it, and his voice has become stronger ever since, and his career has taken off, and it just there's enormous benefit from just speaking out with your convictions. And I found that with I think every single author there, of the papers that within 12 months, you know, there's been a change to their ways of thinking and their careers, and they've pursued you know, the thoughts and the ambitions which they've kept to themselves up to this point. So I hope that, you know, this will be an ongoing debate, and that we'll you know, these leaders these outspeakers will speak out as we become stronger. And yes, I think being united in policy, as Harriet says, is the important first step to agree. I mentioned this afternoon to someone about Chris Puplik's paper on lobbying Canberra, and the conclusion was that well, his verdict really was he was in Parliament at that time, was that no group of lobbyists on the outs in his time had succeeded in anything because they were divided. The group may have been united in their intention, but their hopes for their own companies were so individualistic that they all were clamoring to gain the attention of the parliamentarians, and the verdict was that they should, you know, that you can only take one thought to Canberra, to take six thoughts and six policies will get you nowhere. So unity is very important within diversity, because the other thing I shall repeat, which I've written about, is that I think we should, in looking at regulation, we should go back to the thinking of subsidy and support for the arts and culture should be to do with the way of life of people, and not with the products, because the product comes and goes, and you all know how awful the application forms are that the Australia Council dishes out. They ask none of the questions in those forms really get to anything near the nitty-gritty about why you're applying for funding, and it's just a terrible division of cultural understanding between people who go into public service and public life. And today, they sort of, if they were visionaries once, they lose it in this terrible arguing that's been going on in Parliament in the last 12 months. We've had to endure on television now. But you look at that and think, do we want the arts to have anything to do with any of those people? We don't, you know, we can't even bear to have their vote.
Thank you. That's going to fire us up a little bit.
So we should be more, you know, build up our confidence. And Harriet's idea of you know, starting work on a policy which we can unite the nation is a very good one. And I wish I thought of it myself. Well, good luck to everybody. It's, you know, it's not going to be an easy task from now on. But speaking out is the first step, as we've found at Platform Papers. It has been quite extraordinary, the transformations that some of our authors have undertaken just from that decision to speak out of what they really think.
I think we're also realising the extraordinary legacy of knowledge, and just hearing you sort of say, remember Chris Public's paper, remember this, and what a body of work. So that's part of the next agenda, to make sure that this work is available in a durable digital form, and that as we move forward. Anybody else want to? Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for your wishing us
Well,
good luck. I do have to say, you know, perhaps a bit selfishly, that the department that I'm part of here at the University of Sydney is under notice at the moment for being closed next year. So there are petitions floating around, sign them, write to the Dean. I suspect we'll probably pull through, but it's not a good situation. And we're hearing this week about the drama program at Charles Sturt simply being wound up.
Universities are so essential, but anything that is not aimed at profit doesn't have a tangible outcome. I mean, that's what education is, and we've all enjoyed a good education, and we know that. I can't understand why the government can dare to target universities the way they have. But that's one sector that's under.
I got Amanda. Yeah.
Yeah, Ian, just picking up on that topic of conversation, I've got a question for Harriet and for all of us, and that's in tackling change and proposing future ways forward. Is there a way that Currency House can start to think about how we might want to involve and invite the younger generation to be part of, part of the solving of the current issues and finding a future direction? So yeah, just interested in touching on the younger generation, how we make sure the legacy is passed on, how this generation might be able to model and mentor the younger generation, but also invite them to be part of the way forward.
Yes, quite right. I've been very conscious, well, of two things. First is that this is a meeting of the old guard, and necessarily so because it's looking at the 20 years of platform papers that we've published. So some of these papers are 20 years old. But that was the kind of the theme, the idea of it was, Mum's last paper was the lessons of history. It was looking back. And so we wanted to speak to the old guard. And then we want to make this an annual convention. So next year's convention, we're very much looking towards the new guard. The other group that has been very noticeably absent from this convention has been all our Aboriginal authors who, unfortunately, none of them were able to come. But in some ways, I felt that was a bit of a strength, because I think when we're talking about culture and cultural leadership and what to do, we are lazy as we colonials are very lazy in that we tend to kind of just defer to Aboriginal culture, say, oh, well, they've got it all right and our culture is all wrong. We really need to look at Australia's colonial culture and say, what are the values that we actually want to maintain and develop in the culture that we've received, and then how does that then relate to the culture of the First Nations on whose land this culture is now settled? How do they develop together? I think that was very much what Wesley Enoch's paper was about. So next year's convention, I'm very determined, will be about handed over to First Nations, and not just Aboriginal First Nations, but the Pacific. I really want to look at Australia's identity within the region. We will be opening up to a much more diverse crowd, I think, but also I also want to develop our relationship with the university, and particularly Sydney University, bringing in the students, and I've got various plans in mind, which is, I mean, I really think we should follow the model of that our Aboriginal elders have been demonstrating for so long, which is about passing on the culture to the next generation. And I think that we have that obligation with our culture as well, to not just produce what we want to produce, but also to mentor the next generation. And the university is obviously part of that, and other organisations and so on. So I think make the transition away from how do we sell product and more to how do we nurture the next generation? How do we, as custodians of our culture, what is our role?
Could I make one small suggestion regarding what Amanda was saying, but also ask two questions? The suggestion is, in terms of engaging younger people, could I suggest possibly reaching out to Playwave, which is a project that the City of Sydney provided seed funding for and is run by Shopfront Arts in Sydney, which is based in Carlton, which basically makes theatre tickets affordable for high school students. But what Playwave also does is seek to encourage quite a lot of discussion and sort of connection between young people who go to the theatre, go to live performance. And so you have a group of people young people who are already engaged in going to the theatre, participating in the theatre, because Shopfront is also a young people's theatre. And so that might be a way in for making that connection. My two questions are simply, are people willing to share emails? Because there are people here I'd like to have continuing conversations with in terms of the work I do in my day job. And also, is Julian willing to share the very fascinating Commonwealth Theatre Movement document that he displayed on screen? Because I would love to read the whole thing.
Yeah, I will. They're the minutes from the SEMA meeting. And I'll do a little package of that and a few other documents that I think are really interesting, because these are our elders and they have gone, but they are with us still. And I don't say that in any ethereal way. I mean that physically the very parameters of the debate that we're having were set up by them. So in a way we've got no choice but to try and understand them a little better, particularly in lieu of what Amanda was saying in terms of passing it on, because we're not generating all of it ourselves. We're contributing to it, but things were given to us.
I just think the very fact you've unearthed that is because I have an interest in Australian theatre history, and I'm sort of familiar with it, but I've not heard of that movement. I'm just wondering whether that movement, one of the things that led to the Chifley government commissioning the report from Tyrone Guthrie.
Yeah, there's a very interesting story there, Larry, that I would be very happy to talk with you about at some length, and really fascinating actually to do.
But that's a story for another time.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I'd like to exchange emails, because that's exactly the kind of conversation I would love to have.
Yeah, but I'll do the package with the both ready.
Yeah. Because one of the things that I think is missing, I may be wrong on this, that there's the wonderful Companion to Theatre in Australia, which Currency Press published last century. I think it was last century. But to my knowledge, apart from Geoffrey Milne's book and John West's book, there's no actual general history of Australian theatre. I know there's histories of Australian drama, which is a different thing, but I'm just wondering, is there a history of Australian theatre?
Larry, I can give you the reading list. There's a couple that are possibly not more advanced than Geoffrey Milne's book, but a companion to it. So I'll put those in my communication to you as well.
Terrific.
Oh.
I've got a question about the peak body, which takes us in a slightly different direction. This is just a question for Alison and Harriet, I guess. But I'm a little bit unclear about what is the primary function of the peak body that everybody's talking about, because I suppose I got the impression when the concept came up that it would be essentially an advocacy body, something that would be able to speak with one voice for the arts community to government. But if it's kind of, if we're basing it on, you know, or if it's inspired by or based on, you know, DFAT or what have you, then it's a body of government. It's being funded by government.
You've got two things confused, Nick.
Yeah,
so Alison was talking about an international agency similar to the Gertrum Institute.
right.
And then Mark Williams was talking about, he raised the issue of a peak body, and I asked him what that would look like and whether Currency House could contribute to that in some way. So yes, I'm not sure whether Currency House would qualify as a peak body, but it's certainly it's a place that's going to kind of centralise the discourse.
Right.
Yeah. I think people are rather tired.
Let's wrap it up there on thanking everybody for their attention and energy. Extraordinary today, absolutely extraordinary. 2 days, quite exhilarating for me to be out of faculty university politics into this stuff. We will make sure that we just circulate email lists, and I'm also thinking a reading list. So if people have mentioned a couple of texts, we can look at that, look at those. I've got all the chat, certainly from my rooms and the bits in between. So we've got a bit of a record there. And yeah, I guess that's it, isn't it?
Could that be sent out with the email list? Like
Yeah.
the whole thing, like with what we've done? It'd be very good.
Come together, yeah.
Yeah, we should do some thank yous just very briefly. I can do that as general editor. Max, thank you for running today.
Yes, exactly.
It was like a well-oiled machine. We all felt better. Thomas and Bella, thank you so much for, you know, a trouble-free couple of days, because God knows the conversations were complicated enough without having tech stuff. So it's absolutely fantastic.
Our great pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Oh, it was great. Astrid, I was thinking, as we circulate the reading list, you could also add to that any links that you think is important. So
well, actually, I will say we're running our final couch choir right now. So if you feel like having a sing, you can join in with the thing itself right now. If you want to.
There is, believe it or not, there's a voice that you don't want to hear. It's just so low. And finally, to everybody, because I have seen how hard Harriet has worked, and she really has worked hard. A thank you to Harriet for organising this event and doing not just the logistics, but also the hard thinking behind it in terms of, you know, the kind of the ideas, the key of which is handing on from the past to the future, which is so simple to say, so hard to action.
And I think we should also, I know it's been done in the chat, I think we also should thank Catherine, who started this all with when she and Philip founded Currency Press years ago. And as I said earlier, we would not have an Australian drama canon without Currency Press. With those plays being in print, they would not be taught in schools with those being in print. And if we still had Imperial Honours, which I don't support, Catherine would definitely be Dame Catherine.
Yes, she would. And we can do it informally by referring her now to her from this point onwards as Dame Catherine.
As Dame.
I in conversation refer to her as Dame Catherine already. So.
Or even Duchess.
I'll add one more thank you, which is to my two co-conveners, to Ian and to Julian, and especially to Julian for mentoring me through this whole process, which, as he says, it's been a lot of work, but I've always had him by my side, so it's been wonderful.
Cool.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, have a great week. And we're going to head back to lockdown.
Okay. Goodbye. Nice to see everybody.
See you, everybody.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.